of significant liver fibrosis in the treatment-naive patients with chronic viral hepatitis in Vietnam. So, as we all know, chronic viral hepatitis remains a great burden on public healthcare systems worldwide. According to a report by WHO in 2017, the prevalence of hepatitis B and C in the Western Pacific region, including Vietnam, was 115 million people for hepatitis B, equivalent to 6.2%, and 14 million people for hepatitis C, equivalent to 0.7%. Meanwhile, in Vietnam 2015, a study showed that the prevalence of hepatitis B and C was 15.3% and 3.4%, which are several times higher than the average prevalence in the Western Pacific region. Besides high prevalence, Western Pacific region also had the highest mortality rate of viral hepatitis worldwide, accounting for 1/3 of total mortality rate. And leg complications, which are hepatocellular carcinoma and cirrhosis, were the most common cause of death in patients with viral hepatitis, accounting for nearly 96%. These two complications are lexically of fibrosis progressions in the liver of patients with viral hepatitis. So from this figure, we can see that it's very important to assess and monitor liver fibrosis in patients with viral hepatitis so that we can act properly and start treatment early if necessary. But how can we assess liver fibrosis? So we have liver biopsy. This is the gold standard to assess liver fibrosis, but it's also an invasive method and it comes with high cost. So normally it's not routinely performed in all patients with chronic viral hepatitis, only a subset of specific patients. And we also have non-invasive tests such as transient elastography and serum markers. Transient elastography is also costly in some areas, so its applicability is restricted to just some specific settings. So in the context of Vietnam, a lower middle income country, so what do we have, which is the most appropriate method for resources limited settings? According to recent guidelines by WHO, APRI and P4 are the two preferred non-invasive tests in resource-limited settings, and transient elastography is reserved for settings where it is available and affordable. Another concern is that how good APRI and P4 can perform in the diagnosis of liver fibrosis. So when compared to liver biopsy and transient elastography, these two serum markers had a high area under the ROC curve, ranging from 0.7 to 0.8 in both types of hepatitis. So it can be concluded that these two serum markers can replace liver biopsy and transient elastography in the assessment of liver fibrosis in patients with chronic hepatitis B and C. But there are still some knowledge gaps in the current practice. First, there are few studies using transient elastography as reference to examine performance of APRI and P4. Secondly, there are few studies publishing type-specific cutoffs of APRI and P4 despite differences in natural history of hepatitis B and C. And finally, no previous studies have ever examined performance of APRI and P4 and published their cutoffs in Vietnamese patients. So this study was conducted with three objectives: to estimate prevalence of significant fibrosis and cirrhosis, to examine performance of APRI and P4 in diagnosing significant fibrosis, and to determine predictors of significant fibrosis in Vietnamese patients with chronic viral hepatitis. We all know that liver fibrosis is a common pathway of hepatitis B and C when the liver is damaged by various etiologies. Hepatocytes and other immune cells such as Kupffer cells and leukocytes release chemokines or cytokines, and these chemokines and cytokines in turn activate the hepatic stellate cells from a quiescent form into an activated form, and the activated hepatic stellate cells plays a central role in the development of fibrosis in the liver. But there are still some distinctions between hepatitis B and C in the regarding fibrosis progression. Chronic hepatitis C is a progressive disease, which means that fibrosis progresses with a steady rate of 0.2 fibrosis unit per year. So it normally takes about 20 years for patients to develop cirrhosis. Meanwhile, chronic hepatitis B, fibrosis progression is still progressive, but it's more variable than chronic hepatitis C because the natural history of chronic hepatitis B contains three distinct phases: immune tolerance, immune clearance, and inactive carrier, and these phases are interspersed with many reactivation phases of hepatitis B. So in each phase, the liver damage varies greatly. So that means at some times or at some phases, liver fibrosis can speed up, but at another time or at another phase, it can slow down. So from these differences in the natural history of chronic hepatitis B and C, we can see that it's very crucial to publish type-specific cutoffs of April before. On liver biopsy, we can classify liver fibrosis into 5 stages from F0 to F4 using a meta-VIA score. Significant fibrosis is F2, 3, and 4, and cirrhosis is F4. And transient elastography is a method using unidimensional ultrasound with the probe placed in the right lobe of the liver. So there's a shear wave coming from the probe, and that shear wave propagates through the liver disease. And the machine will measure liver stiffness of liver parenchyma between 25 millimeters and 65 millimeters below the skin surface. And each time of operating transient elastography is considered valid if these 3 criteria are fulfilled. Regarding transient elastography, it's non-invasive, it's very easy to perform, and it's very reliable with high area under the rod curve, high sensitivities and high specificities. But it's also costly in some specific areas, and it requires appropriate equipment and personnel training, which restrict its application, so it cannot be applied extensively in the treatment and monitoring of patients with viral hepatitis. And what about April? These two are serum markers calculated by using AST, ALT, and platelet count, which are 3 parameters routinely tested in patients with viral hepatitis. So they are very easy to calculate, but they also have some limitations, such as they have risk of false positive, as transaminases and platelet count are not specific to the liver. So we need to interpret the results carefully in the context of each patient. And secondly, they are unable to discriminate between intermediate stages like F1 or F3 because of a lack of cutoffs. And this study was conducted at National Hospital of Tropical Disease from March to December 2017. And all adult patients with the diagnosis of chronic hepatitis B and or chronic hepatitis C were included in the study, and those with previous treatment with antiviral therapy were excluded. And chronic hepatitis B and C were defined as follows. With all eligible patients, we collected data of demographics and hazardous drinking using RDC questionnaire. We tested viral markers, viral load genotype, transaminases, and platelet. We also assessed liver fibrosis with transient elastography and calculate APRI-V4. And transient elastography results were interpreted as reliable or unreliable following this algorithm. We used 2 cutoffs of transient elastography, 7.75 kilopascals to diagnose significant fibrosis and 12.5 kilopascals to diagnose cirrhosis. We also use logistic regression analysis and ROC analysis in this study. This study included a total of 261 patients, predominantly male, 66%, and the age median was 43. Chronic hepatitis B was the most common type, 72%, followed by chronic hepatitis C, 24%, and co-infection of chronic hepatitis B and C, 4%. 1/4 of our patients drank alcohol hazardously. 60% of our patients had significant fibrosis, and 1/3 of our patients even developed cirrhosis. The 3 most common genotypes of chronic hepatitis C were 6A, 1A, and 1B, and 2 most common exposure histories were recreational drug abuse and blood transfusion. A fraction, actually 10% of our patients were co-infected with HIV. These figures show rough curves comparing diagnostic accuracy of A prime FIFO in chronic hepatitis B. So we can see that the red line is the FIFO and the blue dotted line is A prime. In chronic hepatitis B, A prime had the area under the ROC curve of 0.72 and FIFO 0.83. The difference here was statistically significant with p-value lower than 0.001. In chronic hepatitis C, A prime had the area under the ROC curve of 0.79 and FIFO 0.69, and the difference here was not statistically significant with p-value of 0.08. So from ROC analysis, we derive for optimal cutoffs for our patients. In chronic hepatitis B, it was 0.73 for A prime and 1.75 for FIFO. In chronic hepatitis C, it was 1.1 for A prime and 2.0 for FIFO. And we can see from this table that all of our cutoffs had high sensitivities, high specificities, high predictive values, high likelihood ratios, and high diagnostic odds ratios. We also identified two independent risk factors of significant fibrosis in chronic hepatitis B, which were A prime equal to or greater than 0.73 and FIFO equal to or greater than 1.75. And interestingly, in our patients, hazardous drinking was not an independent risk factor of significant fibrosis in both types of hepatitis. Regarding performance of A prime and FIFO in our patients with chronic hepatitis C, it was 0.79 and 0.69, which is consistent with other studies in Europe and Asia. In chronic hepatitis B, it was 0.72 for A prime and 0.83 for FIFO. Actually, in chronic hepatitis B, there is a lack of studies using transient elastography as reference method. But when we compare it to studies using biopsy, we can see that our area under the ROC curves were consistent with those studies. And these area under the ROC curves mean area under the ROC curves were acceptable, which means that A prime FIFO can replace biopsy and transient elastography. Our optimal cutoffs are within the range of low and high cutoffs recommended by WHO. Regarding prevalence of significant fibrosis, in chronic hepatitis C, it was 58.7%, which is consistent with other studies in Germany and in Europe, but higher than Australia and lower than Thailand. And in chronic hepatitis B, it was 60.6%, which is higher than other studies in Europe and Asia. Patients are considered as late presentation for care if they present to the hospital with evidences of significant fibrosis or liver stiffness measurement, A prime and FIFO, and with no previous treatment with antiviral therapy. And in our patients, 60.9% were considered late presentation for care, which is very higher than in Denmark, only 32%. However, our studies also has some study limitations. First, there is a lack of universal validated cutoffs, especially in Vietnam for transient elastography to diagnose significant fibrosis and cirrhosis. And secondly, our study was conducted at a tertiary hospital, so it may cause selection bias to some extent. And from the findings from this study, we can draw three main conclusions. First, significant fibrosis was commonly found in nearly 60% of Vietnamese treatment-naive patients with chronic viral hepatitis. Secondly, A prime and FIFO were moderately accurate in discriminating significant fibrosis in both types of hepatitis. And finally, there are two independent risk factors of significant fibrosis in only chronic hepatitis B, A prime equal to or greater than 0.73 and FIFO equal to or greater than 1.75. And from this study, we recommend that A prime FIFO should be extensively used to screen for significant fibrosis in routine management of patients with chronic viral hepatitis in Vietnam. This study was conducted with financial and technical support from World Health Organization. Organization Vietnam office. And thank you for listening.